Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman history. Much of the annals of Eastern Roman history is about the deeds of great men and women. This was to prevent the great events of their age from slipping into oblivion and therefore be lost forever. This was a guiding principle of Roman historiography, as true to Livy as it was to Ammianus Marcellinus and Anna Comnene. But what about the ordinary people that featured in these histories? What was life like for the Joe Bloggs of the day? In this series of videos, I shall cover the experience of life in the late antique, early medieval, high medieval, and late medieval eras. Diocletian ushered in a new era with his reforms of virtually every aspect of the Roman state and society that, at its core, lasted into the 6th and 7th centuries. Family life. Families could be quite large in the 4th, 5th and 6th centuries. Birth rates were quite high. Another factor in the commonality of large families was that exposing unwanted children was widely abandoned due to the Christianization of the empire, a practice that had been perfectly acceptable beforehand. Families of annostiores, the honest or noble people of society, consisted of the parents, their children, their associated officials and servants. These might be the colony or slaves. Many annostiore families were focused on acquiring more property and then passing it on to their heirs. When an aristocrat's son or daughter decided to join a monastery or pursue asceticism, this utterly bewildered some families, as they could not quite fathom why their kin were pursuing poverty and hardship compared to their luxury and means. Contrary to later forms of succession via primogeniture, Roman inheritance was apportioned out to all the children, and complete exclusion of some children from a part of the inheritance could lead to lengthy court cases. This way, women, not usually but sometimes, could be the main inheritor of an estate from their father. Roman families had reverence for both sides of their parents' families, but their father's lineage would take precedence over their mother's. The aristocracy usually married within their social group. Those that married below their station, in essence, became pariahs and are usually never mentioned by their family of former associates again. The parental urge within Roman society was still very strong, even with people without children. Often, those that had no children would interest themselves in the lives of their nephews and nieces, or even further afield. Education. Despite many languages being spoken across the empire, including Egyptian, Brittonic, Moorish, Palmyran and Hispanic, the main language of the empire was Latin. Latin was learned by everyone, possibly as a first or joint language in every region west of Illyria and Africa. However, in the east, one legacy of Alexander the Great was that Egypt, Cyrene, Thrace, Anatolia and the Levant all spoke Greek as their lingua franca, and although they also spoke Latin, it was largely limited to the imperial administration and authorities. Unsurprisingly, when the empire was ruled by men of these regions, such as Leo I from Thrace and Heraclius, who was Armenian in origin, they started using Greek instead of Latin. For the everyman, it tells us that most people were multilingual, at least knowing their own language and Latin in the 4th to 6th centuries. However, most people were illiterate, or could perhaps write 1 or 2 words but nothing else. There were exceptions. Perhaps a community might ensure that one of their number could read and write for the benefit of all, but this is only speculation. Fortunately, most people would be too busy with their labour-intensive tasks to warrant needing an education. Literacy for the late Roman Empire is something that we know qualitatively rather than quantitatively, for just about anyone could become literate, and there are examples of this from all walks of life, from slaves to aristocrats, from men to women, but the proportions of them are unknown. It was in the cities that literacy was highest, and that's where all of the schools were. Education was divided into 3 stages. The first stage was elementary education, the learning how to read and write, starting first with the letters, then syllables, then words, then formulae of letters and short texts. They also learned maths, learning numbers, multiplication, and the rules of arithmetic. Grammar honed the students' arts at reading, understanding, and reproducing the language of Latin or Greek. This way, the classics such as Virgil, Thucydides, and Homer could be appreciated and mimicked. Rhetoric was the third stage and focused on the structure and persuasiveness of their writing. Schools worked in a disciple system. Rhetoricians, grammarians, and teachers could travel around or stay in one place, but one way or the other, a host of schoolboys and young men would follow them and learn from their new masters away from home. These teachers were all private and got their money from the parents of the pupils they were teaching. Many parents taught their children themselves, if they were literate, or they could hire a private tutor, if they had the money. As the centuries passed, the stages of education stayed the same, but later on it morphed into primary education, which taught the pupil how to read and write, and then secondary education, that taught them grammar and rhetoric. The system of education in the Roman Empire was almost exactly the same from the Republic to the 8th century AD, with only minor changes or additions to the content, but not the substance of the syllabus. Learning often took the form of writing down what their teacher said and copying short texts from the classics. Teachers did not adapt their material to meet students' needs, nor did they try to pique their students' particular interests. This they had to do on their own, or not at all. Some writers wrote handbooks for teachers to help improve a teacher's craft at instructing their pupils. An alternative to learning grammar and rhetoric, or in addition to, was learning philosophy. Julian the Apostate is a good example. Philosophers, such as at the School of Athens, could instruct their disciples in the tenets of their philosophy, usually Neoplatonism. The irony is that many churchmen were taught by pagan philosophers. Amusements. Horse races, theatres, baths, celebrations of festivals and holidays, drinking, sex, showmen and women, pets, hunting, games, going out in public and music were all pastimes that the Romans enjoyed. Clothing. Most people by this point wore tunics, trousers, cloaks, boots, and hats. These garments could be dyed, a whole variety of colours from red to green and yellow, or leave them an undyed white. These tunics would have decorative patterns sewn into or embroidered onto the shoulders, near the hem, and near the cuff, in a contrasting colour such as red or black. Togas were only worn by senators, and even this required enforcing through law. Togas and caliga, so distinctly Roman, had been almost completely replaced by these new garments, which were un-Roman and barbarian in their origin. The Roman state's laws on clothing in 382 and 397 should be seen in the context of Roman emperors trying to prevent the growth of barbarian customs in Roman culture. The Theodosian Code, Book 14, titles 10 to 11. When, moreover, a meeting of the white-robed order is being held, or a case of a senator is being tried at a public hearing of a judge, we command the aforesaid senator to be present clad in his toga. Within the venerable city, no person shall be allowed to appropriate to himself the use of boots or trousers. But if any man should attempt to contravene this sanction, we command that in accordance with the sentence of the illustrious prefect, the offender shall be stripped of all his resources and delivered into perpetual exile. For circus factions, such as the Greens and Blues, they would wear hunnic shoes, trousers and cloaks, as well as large billowy tunics that were gathered up at the cuff and tapered out to quite a large breadth at the shoulder. All of these clothes were a higher quality than their usual garments. Understandably, these people put pride into supporting their chariot faction, something Procopius, perhaps a little snobbishly, did not like. Constantine the Great reintroduced being clean-shaven as a popular style, a style that lasted until the reign of Phocas at the dawn of the 7th century. However, that certainly did not stop ordinary people from wearing beards. For example, the bust of Eutropius, possibly the eunuch consul, depicts him with a beard, and Julian the Apostate grew one, equating shaved chins with Christianity and beards with paganism. The townsmen. Evidence from Constantinople suggests that for the wealthier townsmen, houses were towering 2 stories high. Windows were placed away from the streets, overlooking an enclosed courtyard, with street walls being completely solid, undoubtedly to block out the view of the great unwashed. Around the large courtyard was the owner's stable, cattle shed, poultry house, storehouses, and a small cistern for the mansion's watery needs. In the 5th century, the second floor of mansions had windows inserted. Windows of this kind were rectangular, or could be circular, with a stucco frame and set with small glass frames. These glass frames were octagonal or rectangular, and about 8 to 12 inches long. Balconies were very popular, that the Emperor Zeno passed a law that balconies could at most extend 10 feet from the opposite neighbour's house and had to be 15 feet above the ground. Laws also ensured that no house impinged on a neighbour's light or view of the sea. All houses were fitted with drain pipes and gutters. Most houses were built of brick, though some mansions could be made out of marble, set on a brick foundation and faced with stucco. Most houses had sloping roofs, but the wealthier houses had flat terraces. These were so that the occupants could go out on the roof to enjoy the sunlight without having to leave their dwelling. Houses generally were based around a central hall, bespoke with wooden or stone columns, with the bedrooms on the upper floors. Staircases were generally made of wood, and sometimes of stone. These large townhouses had multiple sitting rooms. They had a garden. They had a hot room for very cold days. Richer houses had a hypercaust for central heating, and poorer houses had braziers. Kitchens had a low hearth with a connecting chimney made of square pipes to carry off the smoke. All houses had a toilet with a drainage system that eventually led into the sea. The wealthy usually had a private chapel or shrine within their grounds. Although these types of houses were used by the wealthy and middle class, the poor had very different housing. The moneyed poor could live in small houses with rushes for a roof and flattened earth floors. Another form of housing was the block of flats that could have anything from 5 to 9 stories. These came to Constantinople in the 5th century, and each floor was divided into flats. These flats were very squalid and were rented to tenants. Despite the poverty of these sorts of dwellings, hovels housed an even more destitute level of poor. Some hovels were little more than a roof over their occupant's head, and were common throughout the city. Ironically, a large district of hovels were located near the imperial palace. These slums were breeding grounds for theft, murder, and civil disturbances. The centre of the ordinary townsman's life was the Hippodrome. People would queue up and receive a token for their admittance at no cost. Virtually all of the marble seats were open for everyone rich or poor, onostiore or humiliore. The Hippodrome of Constantinople was used for far more than just horse racing. Public performances, torture, religious ceremonies such as Palm Sunday, and political meetings were also held within its walls. It could seat 40,000 people and was modelled on the Circus Maximus in Rome. A spina in the centre marked the impassable area that the charioteers had to race around. The racecourse itself could fit 4 chariots abreast, one for the greens, the blues, the reds, and the whites. For a race to go ahead, they needed the emperor's permission and 2 days of preparation. 8 races could be held a day, and in between these, mimes, acrobats, singers, actors, and dancers would entertain the crowds. Such performances were frowned upon by the church and had them restricted on Saturdays and Sundays. Theatres were perfect places for local magistrates to make announcements to the urban population. With a populace having no formal power, these gatherings in the theatre and hippodrome were the only means with which a city's populace could express its views to their local authorities. The people played a humble but essential role in the administration of a city by providing its night watchmen, fire brigade, street and sewer cleaners, and craftsmen and labourers for the repair and erection of public works. It also, through the civic authorities, supplied workers to the imperial government for public posts and other services. These services were corvées, performed for limited periods, usually a year in rotation. The selection of citizens for the various duties was, in the West, entrusted to the craft guilds into which the urban population was organised. In Egypt, a different system was employed. The cities were divided into tribes, which were in fact wards, and these supplied the necessary workers in rotation, year by year. Each city had a curia, a council of curiales, or as they are otherwise known, decurions, that sat for life. Each year they would elect the year's magistrates that would administer the city and collect taxes. In Egypt, each city had 2 ripari, which were responsible for public safety in the countryside, and under them 2 commanders of the night watch, who ensured security in the city. The names of these officers differed in different regions, but every city in both East and West had 2 constables that maintained public law and order. At markets, as well as buying and selling goods, people also came to them to hear news and talk to their friends and clients. Important business decisions or family matters could be hammered out during a walk in the forum. These markets, as well as being the shop fronts of jewellers, moneylenders and traders, were also swarming with peddlers, magicians, astrologers and fortune tellers, more than willing to deprive gullible people out of their money. Among these cretins were merchants that wanted to sell embroideries, shoes, textiles, metalwork and all manner of food and drink. The aristocracy rode around in carriages. Noble ladies were accompanied by a host of eunuchs, whether they were going by carriage or litter. Noble men rode around on white horses, probably Arab thoroughbreds, with their servants armed with sticks to beat the riffraff out of their master's way. Public gardens were very popular with the Romans. Even in the imperial palace, one of the indoor rooms had been turned into a garden for an emperor to tend. Except for the emperor and his relatives, everyone, when they died, was buried outside of the city. The city was a place of life, and was no place for the dead. This was also a sanitary measure, and there was also a lack of space as well. The levels of squalor and the proximity of people to each other meant that leprosy and plagues were quite common in towns and cities. However, doctors were fairly universal throughout the whole of the Roman Empire, and thus these kinds of diseases could be diagnosed and treated. The countryside. The countryside was based around the village community in the east, with vast villas being less common. In the west, the opposite was true. Farmsteads were scattered throughout the countryside, and villas speckled the land. In the east, villages were not a ramshackle cluster of wooden barns and draughty hovels, but in Syria were rather stone-built houses of a respectable size and foundation. Buildings that could be expected to be found in a large eastern village, such as Capopera, were churches, baths, fountains, barns, pubs, a local monument, and perhaps a high street. Some houses even had mosaic floors. This gives an idea of the higher standard of living that was permitted in the East due to its greater wealth and peace compared to the West, Africa, and the Balkans, especially during the 5th century. In the West, villages did exist, but they were nowhere near as important or common as in the East. Many priests and bishops in villages became an important element in village life, slowly developing a parish. Villas still played a vital local industrial role, but with the destructive invasions in the West, many villas in Britain and Gaul were abandoned and fell into ruin. These villages, villas and farmsteads were often lightly defended. Fleeing to the local fortified town or fort for refuge was the best option for many. Small raids and brigands could be fended off with local defences and by the limitani, but any kind of large and concerted force would crush these defences. Farms and villages could be surrounded with a ditch and rampart. In Britain, Iron Age hill forts were widely reoccupied because of their defensiveness. Villas had towers and curtain walls added to them. Villages might simply have a strong tower for its populace and livestock to take shelter in. Many rural sites were not fortified at all. The population of the countryside was mainly made up of the colony, a dependent peasant. However, interspersed with these would be freemen who owned their own land and slaves belonging to the local landlords. A 6th century example from Tatavium shows one man owned a small house, 2 water meadows leased to 2 dairy farmers, and 6 tenant farmers of colony status. Most fields on average were worked by 2 to 4 colony. Rents for large farms were 5 solidi and 21 soliloquy per year, generally cultivated by 4 tenants. A small farm's rent was 3 solidi and 3 soliloquy per year, considering that in the reign of Julian the Apostate to the late 5th century, a comitatus infantryman was paid 9 solidi a year, and a limitanus soldier was paid 5 solidi a year. In addition to what they were paid in kind, land rents were quite expensive, which made generating revenue from the land even more important for free peasants. Corruption in the countryside was always present. Wealthy landowners could obtain under-assessed tax burdens, and the curiales would have to overcharge the freemen to make up the difference. This, among many other corrupt practices, were tolerable, but if the farmer met misfortune, then it could ruin him. For example, if their farm was burned by a raid, or there was a persistent drought, the farmer could mortgage his farm. Alternatively, he and his family would starve, or have to give up his and his family's freedom, becoming a colonist. The largest group in the countryside was the colonists. They were tied to their land, and if they tried to flee, would be caught and returned. However, unlike a slave, they were personally free, and were not property. They could enlist in the army, take holy orders, alienate their property, and even sue their landlords. Freemen could also temporarily become a short-term tenant farmer, but not become a colonist. Slaves were not numerous enough in the late Roman Empire to be able to support large-scale slave labour. Merchants and craftsmen. Trade was heavily regulated by the state and reflects the highly invasive nature of the state during the late Roman Empire. Industries at their heart had guilds to govern them. Guilds were more often than not the instrument of the government rather than an organisation for the fair treatment of its members or local inhabitants. But they did do this. Guild membership was hereditary, had some municipal duties, and paid fixed tariffs. A famous one was the chrysagoron, which was a tax on traders that was instituted by Constantine I. It was to everyone's satisfaction that it was lifted by Anastasius I nearly 2 centuries later. Guilds were very abundant, as there were a separate guild for pork butchers and beef butchers, as well as chicken and venison and so on. Guilds drew up conditions of work, fixed wages, selling prices and profits. To become a guild member, you had to pay an entrance fee and proof of your craft. Slaves. Slavery was present during the late Roman Empire, but not on the same scale as it had been during the Republic or Principate. The most common status of manual worker was the colonist or dependent peasant rather than the slave. Slaves in the late Empire were considered property, but there were many laws regarding slaves and their owners. For example, Constantine the Great decreed that if a slave died from a punishment that their master was administering, such as a beating, then the owner would not be prosecuted for murder. This law reflects the fact that the relationship between the freeman and the slave was very different. Laws between freeman and slave were usually very harsh on the slave and quite lenient on the freeman. Laws between slaves and slaves were usually a bit fairer, but if a slave committed a crime against a freeman, they would usually be punished very severely. This is the first part of my brief look at daily life in the Eastern Roman Empire. Links to the other parts can be found in the description below. I have been your host Daniel Maynard, and this has been Eastern Roman History.